You're watching The Legal Breakdown. Glenn, we have some major news here. We have been watching all of these troop deployment cases play themselves out in California, in Oregon, in Chicago, Illinois, and so far all of the rulings have been either temporary restraining orders or preliminary injunctions. So we hadn't yet had a case where a judge had ruled on the merits of Donald Trump's troop deployments. We finally have a ruling on the merits, this one out of Portland. Can you explain what just happened in court?
Yeah, Brian, Trump-appointed Judge Karen Immergut held a trial, a 3-day trial, with witnesses, law enforcement witnesses who testified, federal law enforcement, state law enforcement, local law enforcement, hundreds of documents received into evidence, and she just ruled that Donald Trump violated federal law. For anybody scoring at home, 10 U.S.C. Section 12406. He violated the 10th Amendment to the Constitution by trying to deploy streets to Portland, Oregon, and she permanently enjoined him, prohibited him from deploying National Guard troops to the streets of Portland or, frankly, anywhere in the state of Oregon. This is now set in stone. It's a permanent injunction, meaning it will last for the entire life of the case unless and until a higher court decides to reverse it. Yeah, so now, Brian, this is a permanent injunction, a permanent prohibition, preventing Donald Trump from deploying National Guard troops not only to the streets of Portland, but anywhere in the state of Oregon. So now this will remain in place, of course, unless and until a higher court of appeals, including the Supreme Court, decides they don't like that ruling and decides to try to reverse it.
Glenn, does this mark something of a paradigm shift in that we've seen so many judges offer up deference to this administration, offer up the presumption of regularity? Was there anything that Judge Immergut said that could lend itself to this idea that finally judges are waking up, wising up to the fact that this administration is not acting in good faith and, in fact, will weaponize the law to help themselves?
Yeah, it's a great question because she not only ruled that he violated federal law, and that he violated the 10th Amendment to the Constitution, which separates the states' rights from the federal government's rights. And she said he so clearly and unlawfully, unconstitutionally stepped over that line and interfered in the state's right to run its own National Guard troops. She not only ruled that it was unlawful and unconstitutional, but she really condemned it, and she highlighted the danger of this kind of conduct by a president of the United States. Let me read one short paragraph because I have to tell you, it kind of sings. Judge Immergut is completely unflinching in the face of Trump's lawlessness. She says, "This court acknowledges that some citizens may support these deployments as a helpful military supplement to effectuate the president's immigration agenda, but the founders embodied their profound fear and distrust of military power in the Constitution and its amendments, which has lived on through the decades as a traditional and strong resistance of Americans to any military intrusion into civilian affairs. In the Supreme Court's words, even slight encroachments create new boundaries from which legions of power can seek new territory to capture." That is pretty strong language when she is suggesting that, if we ignore the separation of powers between the federal government and the states' rights, there may be new territory that is captured by inference by Donald Trump and his lawlessness. She says, "This principle has been foundational to the safeguarding of our fundamental liberties under the Constitution." So, it just shows that the federal judges, Brian, including Trump-appointed judges, are unflinching in the face of Trump's lawlessness and unconstitutionality.
All right, so Glenn, we had talked about the fact that, initially we had only seen temporary restraining orders or preliminary injunctions, and all of the appeals, even in the 7th Circuit, even in the 9th Circuit, were all appeals on those preliminary injunctions and temporary restraining orders, and we hadn't yet had a case on the merits. And so the fact that we have the first ruling on the merits and it's against the Trump administration, what kind of an impact does this have on two things? The ongoing cases also in LA and in Chicago, but also the inevitable appeal up to the Supreme Court.
You know, I don't want to overstate the sort of atmospheric precedent that this might set for other jurisdictions where Trump tries to pull the same unconstitutional bullshit. And the reason I say I don't want to be too, broad in applying this elsewhere is because Judge Immergut makes clear that in the trial, what, she was dealing with was there was like one block where there was an ICE facility. And back in June, there were some incidents of violence, but really since then, it's been relatively violence-free. She even said, some of the information suggests that, there are still some dust-ups around that building in that one block area. But she said, the dust-ups are between often protesters and counter-protesters, and they're easily handled by kind of regular civilian law enforcement forces. So, it's an important pronouncement, and I love some of the language she used about the danger of not addressing a violation of the state's rights by the federal government. However, it really is largely bound to the facts as they were established in the trial that she conducted. So, there's a little bit of something there for everybody. The people who would like to say, listen, this should kind of settle it nationwide. Well, yes and no, because it's really ultimately only settling the circumstances that she found pursuant to the litigation that she conducted on this issue.
Is there any indication from the Trump team yet whether they're going to appeal?
Not that I've heard yet. This is a brand new ruling that just came down from Judge Immergut. But when has the Trump administration not appealed something that has gone against them?
Well, the reason I asked that, though, there may be some concern, recognizing that the Seventh Circuit is not necessarily this is not the 11th Circuit. It's not some big conservative bastion. And so is there some concern that if they do appeal a ruling where they lost on the merits, it's not precedent because it's the trial court, but once it gets into the appeals court level, then it does become precedent. And so could that be any concern or any reason for the Trump administration maybe to reconsider immediately running up to the appeals court?
Yeah, Brian, there's so many moving pieces in multiple jurisdictions. Our viewers will probably recall that there was litigation over Trump's attempted deployment of National Guard troops to Chicago. Now, that is on hold, and that's still kind of kicking around in the Seventh Circuit Court of Appeals, but Donald Trump is trying to bubble that one up to the Supreme Court. Out in the Ninth Circuit, which includes both Oregon and California, there is some litigation kicking around. But here's what I can almost promise, not that I'm happy about it. I think all of these matters are going to be consolidated. They're all going to be taken up by the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court will want to announce sort of one principle, one interpretation of the law and the Constitution when it comes to Trump's ability, his authority to federalize and deploy National Guard troops. And then they will return it to the various states and the lower federal courts to implement whatever it is the Supreme Court comes up with. If I had to bet my one buck, which is my betting limit, it will probably involve an expansion of presidential power. I'm just going to take a flyer that that's what the Supreme Court might do again. But ultimately, all of this, I'm not going to say is for naught, but it's all going to make its way up and be consolidated and decided by the Supreme Court.
And that was going to be my next question here. To what extent do you think that this Supreme Court is even going to care about any precedent, whether it's a precedent from a trial court or even precedent from appeals courts?
Well, they have shown really extreme disrespect for federal trial court judges and federal courts of appeals when they put out 100, 160 in some instances page opinions that meticulously detail all of the precedent involved, including Supreme Court precedent. And, the radical right-wing majority of the Supreme Court seems forever determined to throw it all out without saying why in these shadow docket decisions and expand presidential power. Listen, if they found presidential immunity in the Constitution, even though the express terms of the Constitution in a couple of ways disallow for presidential immunity, why do we think they would do anything but expand presidential power in the military arena when they have already said, listen, that's one of the core constitutional functions of a president. of a president that nobody can touch. So, I'm not wildly optimistic that we're going to get a good sort of democracy-saving opinion out of the Supreme Court on this one.
To that end, what kind of an impact does this ruling by Judge Immergut have for you? Does the fact that we did see a trial court rule on the merits against Trump's completely baseless troop deployment, because remember, there is no foreign invasion, there is no insurrection, and there is no failure of the local government to effectuate its laws, and so none of the planks that would have facilitated the deployment of troops domestically were met, and this judge recognized that and ruled accordingly. So does that hold any weight for you, at least as you think about the judiciary kind of holding itself up as a bulwark against Trump?
Generally, the way I look at it is pressure bursts pipes, and I think there is a certain pressure generated by federal trial court judges, particularly ones appointed by Trump, and there are a number of judges appointed by President Ronald Reagan, George H.W. Bush, George W. Bush, who have pretty consistently and vocally ruled against Donald Trump's lawlessness, unconstitutionality, and general abuse of power. All of that should generate pressure. Now, whether there is any pressure felt by the Supreme Court, given that they are above the law, they have no mandatory code of ethics. They're the only 9 federal government employees who operate in an ethics-free zone. They can do whatever they damn well please. I don't know that they feel the pressure, but I do think it generates pressure that may be sort of felt by politicians. It may be felt by the American people when they see these federal court judges standing up, doing the right thing, protecting democracy, abiding by the rule of law and the Constitution. It becomes a powerful expectation that that is the way, a democracy is supposed to operate. So, I still think it generates pressure. I just don't know if that pressure bubbles all the way up to the Supreme Court, which is really where it needs to be felt the most, because all of the lower court opinions in the world, no matter how loyal they are to the Constitution and the rule of law, can be tossed out on a whim by, a majority of the Supreme Court justices.
All right, well, obviously this is a story that continues to develop here as we await an inevitable appeal both to the Circuit Court and then the U.S. Supreme Court. And we're also waiting on some rulings here in Los Angeles and Chicago on the same issue. And I'm sure Donald Trump is going to continue to flex his autocratic muscles and try and deploy troops to other cities. And so there's a lot happening right here. So for those who are watching, if you want to follow along, please make sure to subscribe. I'm going to put the links to both of our channels right here on the screen. It's the best way to support our work. It is completely free, and it's a great way to support independent media. So if you're not yet subscribed, please go ahead and subscribe. I'm Brian Tyler Cohen.
And I'm Glenn Kirshner.
You're watching The Legal Breakdown.